Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Goth Nick and Goth Chick, the podcast where we discuss the Gothic in all of its forms. I'm your host, Nick Vanderwaard.
I'm Lindsay Wheeler.
And today we'll be discussing ontology. We'll be talking about it more generally, as proposed by Derrida. But first, we'll be delving into the origins of the Gothic novel relative to hauntology, as produced by Horace Walpole with his novella, The Castle of Otranto. From there, we'll be delving into hauntology versus pastiche and various other phenomena that occur relative to each.
So what's our topic today, Nick?
Our topic today will be ontology. Ontology is probably the oldest of all the Gothic components, and the only reason I say that is because it was the most predominant one featured in the first so-called Gothic novel. So if you read The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, ontology is the thing that's most on display, even if you could make an argument for the novel having some uncanny elements or some abject elements. For the most part, its focus or its claim to fame is ontology. Ontology is essentially a past aesthetic that is displaced from actual history. Gothic stories that utilize ontology will have settings that seem antiquated in some shape or form, but don't actually come from anywhere. And what I mean by that is they're out of time, and that's a result of the language being used, where you're using a past system of language to denote a pastness without the thing itself actually belonging to the past. But it also doesn't belong to the present because it feels anachronistic due to the past system of language. But the past system of language, the symbols, the icons, the manners of speech, all of these different things that can be codified and collected and represented by a space and its artifacts, all of these are like archaic. They denote a sense of age, but they can also be recreated by the author to convey that sense of age without actually having come from that particular period.
Okay.
Because a lot of these things actually are pointing to particular points in time, but they also tend to be a collection of different time periods. Like, just because something's anachronistic doesn't mean that they're all from the same point. Instead of like, oh, well, they all come from the late medieval period, or they all come from the Hellenistic period of ancient Greece or something like that. What you tend to get is just a general feeling of pastness by having an assortment of different things that all have one thing in common, which is the past. In The Castle of Otranto, Horace Walpole was creating a romanticized version of the medieval past. The images and artifacts which denote age were sort of lifted out of history and placed in a chaotic fashion within this space. Sort of like a decorator kind of choosing things that appear a very particular way to denote age. But again, the effect, the intended effect, is one of ontology, where you feel that sense of the past, but you also feel a sense of otherness because you can't connect the images specifically to any point in time. It allows things to feel less concrete than they would if you were at a historical exhibit where this actually happened. These were the people. It demystifies by presenting things accurately and clearly, where hauntology doesn't do that. It puts you in this liminal space with these past objects that aren't really connected to the past, but they're not really at home in the present. And this allows you to experience sensations that are sort of a revived depiction of the Gothic, in the sense of enter this space and experience the Gothic as it's been romanticized or expanded upon.
It kind of makes me think of a lot of museum displays that either have replicas of items that it's not an actual item from that time period, but it kind of denotes a generalized version of something, or like sometimes there's like those like they'll have the wax figures and stuff. It'll be a scene,
Yeah.
and it's not like that actual scene with those people. Those aren't even oftentimes like specific people. Sometimes it can be, but the scene itself may not have ever happened, especially not as it's depicted, but it's just there to give you a sense of that time and
without actually being connected to the specific events.
Yeah.
And when ontology occurs, there's a sense of displacement where you don't feel like you're really in the past, even though the past language is there, and you don't feel like you're in the present. And this is generally conveyed through architecture, through space, that conveys a sense of false advertisement. Because what you're getting isn't actually the past.
Mm-hmm.
But you're also not totally at home in the present. Even if you're experiencing it in the present space and time, you're taken away to some liminal space that's neither here nor there. And it allows you to experience certain kinds of sensations that are Gothic. It's a way of making time and space feel sort of murky. Not just by the author, who's sort of created a narrative, but he's placed a series of devices that cause you, the reader, to experience them for yourself. Instead of him doing all of the work, he just arranges these things in a particular way that informs your imagination in a way that never feels wholly concrete. Mm-hmm. That's ontology in a nutshell. The word itself comes from Derrida. In the early 90s, he coined the term as haunt and ontology. And when you say haunt, through the French pronunciation, you say haunt. Oh. So, ontology. It's sort of an academic play on words. But the term refers to being haunted by, if existence is something that you can sort of pin down according to language and history being depicted by language, where that becomes a lot less clear in certain types of language experiments. And Derrida was isolating the term so you could apply it to different things. He's like, okay, this is just the phenomena itself, and he's talking about it over 200 years after Horace Walpole wrote his Gothic story.
Yeah.
But it's applicable to the Gothic in its earliest sort of stages. When I think of some of these other devices that we've discussed, the uncanny, the abject, they kind of came later in the same century. So when Horace Walpole wrote The Castle of Otranto, that was in 1764. Then later in the 1790s, you had authors like Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis, who wrote stories that weren't quite as invested in that treasure house of hauntological symbols. Like instead of just putting the character in a castle where the main effect that you're experiencing is hauntological. Mm-hmm. With Anne Radcliffe, there were elements of that, but there were also feelings of terror. She wrote terrifying novels that had a lot of spectral or illusory qualities. And then Matthew Lewis, when he wrote The Monk, it was all about the male Gothic, where things are supernatural and they have lots of sex and violence and a bad ending and confrontation with demons and devils in a very supernatural kind of way. And that's sort of their selling point or their claim to fame, what they made famous and what people took and ran with later. But the Gothic, the movement itself started with Horace Walpole, and it started with ontology. The Gothic, at its most basic, I think, can be described as a fear of the past. And that has to do with the past as hauntological in origin, where the things that you're afraid of are liminal. They're not... You're more afraid of the boogeyman. You're more afraid of the
concept.
The concept of an imagined past, which is different than the actual past.
Right.
This notion of ontology is something that occurs within people more generally. Even though it's a specific symptom of reading the story, it's an intended effect that Horace Walpole engineered he's also drawing attention to the way that our imagination responds to the past as imagined for us in media.
Yeah.
And he was deliberately delivering the type of past that would cause our imagination to really react in that kind of way, in a pointed way that would draw our attention to our own response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes sense as a convenient way of creating a space that has enough familiar elements that the reader, like, a reader can imagine a dilapidated old house or like an ancient tomb, and you can describe elements of those kind of settings and they can understand those concepts. Like, if we ran with a tomb, like, you know, they might be familiar with the pyramids in Egypt and, you know, what a sarcophagus looks like. Like, they're familiar with these elements, but they're not from ancient Egypt, so they wouldn't know what... The reader is presumably not an expert on the topic either, so you can throw them in that setting without having to recreate it faithfully.
No, you're very deliberately
Exactly.
presenting an unfaithful recreation of it without necessarily having a disclaimer at the start.
Yeah.
You know, you're trying to pass it off as something that could actually occur. Because in order for a fear to affect the audience, there has to be some type of belief involved.
And some familiarity enough to give some grounding. It's not a completely foreign concept or setting, but so they can at least imagine it and imagine themselves in it. But as far as the details beyond that, you have so much wiggle room to
introduce things that either don't seem to really fit, other than they're ontological, and they are all from the past. And you'll notice that the past becomes sort of an umbrella. You can fit a lot of things under the brim of that umbrella just because they belong to the past. And the past kind of expands in ways that become ancient in the sense of the past being a notion of everything that existed before. And it becomes sort of nebulous.
Yes.
And the term Gothic refers to essentially the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages. And in terms of recorded history, that was very imprecise. There wasn't a lot of information to go on. It was dark and murky.
Yeah.
And people having access to these different elements would tend to sort of clump them together or group them together and say that, oh, well, this seems Gothic to me. It seems foreign. It seems old. But also an element of danger, because the Gothic period refers to the Dark Ages, which were a result of the fall of civilization, the fall of Rome. And then after that, there was this period of darkness and chaos. And then coming out of that, referring backward to the Gothic period, you're taking that idea, the Gothic, and you're moving it forward. And you're saying, we're experiencing a Gothic moment. But the term Gothic is fraught with imagination. And it's fraught with having like bits and pieces of either actual history that has been fragmented to such a degree that you can't really piece it together. And then a lot of the glue is actually people's reimaginings of it. The palimpsest, to borrow from Derrida again, is a text that came before that informs a present text. And our view of the past is informed by older versions of media that have tried to re-envision the past, but they're also aware of all of these things that they're taking and putting into a space for the audience to experience. Stories like Under the Pyramids by H.P. Lovecraft. This type of story is a very exotic version of Egypt and the pyramid and all of these sort of unsavory dark figures that are around it, and Harry Houdini, a man of the West, becomes embroiled within this vision of Egypt. That appearance of Egypt as generated by H.P. Lovecraft doesn't just exist in his mind. It's informed by older texts that had a similar view of things. And even someone like Horace Walpole was sort of taking all of this information these depictions of the Gothic past, all of these different sort of romanticized versions of it, and he was creating sort of like a grand romance that was composed of individual romantic elements that had the look and feel of the past. That thing that you're trying to get at, that goes beyond what actual history written down can produce. And that's another thing that I feel I should mention, is that the use of romance and the use of imagination is to sort of get beyond what is normally communicated in history itself. There's an element of the unspeakable, where history itself tends to exclude what imagination can sort of expound upon, intimate. The notion of, if you can think of it, chances are it exists in some shape or form, and there is so much more beyond history as what people choose to write down, as opposed to, well, I'm going to try and imagine or suggest history beyond what normally exists. That's sort of the critical element of the hauntological.
So rather than being the unexplainable, it's the unknowable.
If history is the result of the powers that be deciding what people get to know ahead of time when they choose to write down what they write down, and there's other things that get left out. Now, in the case of Horace Walpole, his particular mystery or his particular atrocity is actually fairly mundane. It's a property dispute, and Lord Manfred at the castle of Otranto insists that his claim to the castle is sacrosanct. Like, his role as lord of that domain is legit. It's also bogus. And all of that history, all of the things on the walls are sort of telling a different story than what he himself is suggesting, where imagine if you asked Lord Manfred, you're actually a lord, right? And he would say, oh yeah, totally. But then there are all of these things on the wall, portraits of former family members, other artifacts of the past that seem to paint a different story, but they do it through the power of suggestion. They do it in a very chaotic, organic way with darkness and the supernatural and figures in their paintings getting up and sort of leaving the frame or staring down at you with dark, menacing eyes. The suggestion is menacing or uncomfortable, and sometimes it's overt. The acuity is felt through the way it's sort of presented, almost like I'm feeling this way because the author is choosing to present it as such. Because it's one thing to just have a painting on the wall and say, well, I'm getting a certain feeling from this painting. But imagine the painting as having been painted to be conducive to whatever sinister effect you're feeling relative to the past. Someone like Walpole, where you're dealing with the sense of the unknowable or the sense of the elusive elements of the past. There's no way that you'll really know the truth with some of these things.
Yeah.
Either they're oppressed, or they're forgotten, or they're destroyed, or they're lost to history, or to unrecorded history. History in the sense of events that people wrote about in a way that concealed what actually occurred. And he's illustrating that by putting people in a situation where this type of narrative is not set in stone, where you're inside what would normally be ironclad. Like, if Lord Manfred were a real character in a real castle, he would be doing his very best to do away with anything that might suggest his reign as false, and his bloodline as well. That's kind of what Horace Walpole is focusing on. But there are so many other things that you could think about instead. Like, what is buried under the rubble? What is the effect of these stories trying to get at? And in Walpole's case, he's using ontology to essentially say the right of kings is fickle, or it's false. It's not perfect because it's still bound up in the conventions of older stories. And there's a sense of moralizing at the end, and that there is sort of a true king, and the dark castle at the end crumbles, and in its place is like a bright, perfect castle, and that the true heir is revealed, the return of the true king. even if you fast forward to a story like The Dark Crystal, where the notion of the false ruler is replaced by the actual ruler, you have to ask yourself, is a story like that playing the same type of role? Like, it's fulfilling that same role of what Manfred desires. It's just substituting him with someone else. That's an issue with these stories, is it doesn't do away with the problematic elements. It doesn't try to say, look, let's just get rid of these and try and get to the bottom of things in a way that isn't confusing, that isn't murky. Because why end the story like that? It's like, wait, if Lord Manfred is the problem, and if this is sort of a symptom of the past in a way that we don't want to return, then why end the story in a way that presents a happy ending as being, well, the true king came home, and it's like, shouldn't we be moving away from that? And his argument is that there's no really escaping of it, too. There's a sense of the past as being unavoidable, or depictions of the past are unavoidable, but what he's doing is he's taking that and running with it, and sort of playing with these relics in a way that sort of points out the problems of history, but also there's an entertaining component. There are so many instances of stories that are dealing with sort of the past is imagined in such a way, a lot of Lovecraft stories like that, where there's this sense of the past as being littered with all of these relics and authors and works that they had done, and if you imagine each one of those as a brick, then the entire structure is just composed of all of these different sort of elements in a way that isn't that different from Walpole, where you're trying to sort of convey the past, and in order to do that, you take all of these different palimpsestual elements and you sort of put them together. It doesn't make any sense if you think about it chronologically, but if you think about it as just belonging to the past, it's actually quite effective, just in terms of creating atmosphere.
Oh yeah, it's a great way to make a familiar setting exotic.
Yeah, exotic, romantic.
Yeah, and threatening.
It can be. The Gothic, again, focuses on the presence of something within the Terminator, where there's a sense of dislocation relative to the present and the past, though in the Terminator's case, the past is actually the future. It gets kind of confusing, but the fear of the past in that film is a future that hasn't happened yet. Right off the bat, things are kind of confusing. If you can ascertain where the danger is relative to time, and the Goths are in the past, or Skynet hasn't happened yet, or he has happened but in the future, which happened already for Cal Reese but not for Sarah Connor. You see how everything is kind of swimming about, and then combine that with an everyday setting that you can actually walk around inside.
Right.
And that is attached to LA that has been destroyed, LA that exists currently, but is also kind of dark and crumbling, especially at night, where things already seem kind of primed to fall apart. Certain things in the present parallel what has happened already. Amid all of this, there is this menace within the icons that you hide behind. Imagine a house full of dolls, a house full of humanoid shapes, like a bust or an effigy or an oil painting.
Wax figures.
A wax figure, exactly. And when you look at that in the darkness, you almost feel like it can come alive.
Yeah.
And then when you turn your back on it, out from that wall of homunculi emerges an actual humanoid threat.
Kind of like the mannequins in Silent Hill games.
Or Halloween, the remake, so Halloween 2018, they had a scene where Laurie Strode is in her house, which is full of all of these mannequins that she's used for target practice. And they're just piled up everywhere. What ends up happening is Michael Myers comes home, and the lights are off, and she's looking around with a flashlight, and it illuminates things to such a degree that you can kind of have an idea of what you're looking at. But it's just this mess, this midden of darkness and images.
Humanoid shapes
that are attached to traumatic events, in her case, target practice.
Yeah.
Relative to the actual destroyer,
Yeah.
Michael Myers. Why is she shooting the mannequins? So that she can shoot Michael Myers. And yet, in this quest for revenge, she has put herself in a situation where she's surrounded by all of these images, which is meant to convey emotions responding to the past in a way that is not discrete, where these things tend to surround you. And that you could say the person who wrote the screenplay for that film was doing it deliberately, but that deliberation is done to suggest what actually happens in real life relative to history and the past as something that we talk about, that we depict in entertainment and just more generally. And that civilization, Lacan's notion of the symbolic order, right, where everything around us is language. And then Derrida saying there is no outside of the text, so that this symbolic order that Lacan is talking about, civilization and texts and all of this language exists in a way that isn't as segregated as we would like to think. And there is so much invention going on in terms of what we're being told to believe versus how we feel relative to horror media. Something like The Terminator is depicting it in a very pointed way by presenting reality as tenuous in a way that could really go sideways. And you could say that's just bullshit, but some of those fears are very real, or they're real in the sense of they pertain to serial killers in the 1980s. That's a real phenomena. It's a real place that they're within. Technophobia. Even if those fears are baseless, let's say there are no Terminators, it's pointing us at the potential of a great destroyer coming home to roost. And that type of thing has occurred in the past in so many ways that tends to get sort of papered over. And that barrier in stories like The Terminator is made thin deliberately, and that a lot of the tension is felt amid that hauntological presentation where the thing is hiding behind the icons, the wall of mannequins, or the humanoid shapes. And in the case of The Terminator, the humanoid shape is the skin over the metal skeleton, the object of fear. But it also is hiding behind time itself as a curtain. When the lights go out and when all of these nightmares are occurring, you feel sort of off balance. And you're not really sure where you are. Are you in LA in 1984? Or are you on the battlefield in the year 2027? All of that confusion is just another thing for the destroyer to hide behind. And whether or not it's real, like, is there actually a Terminator, is completely beside the point. Because these sensations are things that people fear and experience. And fear of the other, fear of the past, fear of the foreign, tends to occur within domesticated environments that the Goths never set foot in England. But so many stories are birthed from that fear. But they're not all totally false. There's an element of truth and fiction. Horace Walpole's story, The Castle of Otranto, was originally published anonymously. And he said, this is a historical document. A year or so later, he says, actually, I made up the whole thing. And he found himself in hot water when he did that because he was the son of the prime minister. He was effectively playing off people's imaginations. But is that totally without merit? You know, the types of things that he's suggesting are potentially true. The notion of the hauntological is just a phenomena that occurs more generally, is meant to convey how language works and how there's always an element of fear relative to the past as something that is being reimagined in some shape or form. But with Horace Walpole, he's just doing it very deliberately. James Cameron, his depiction of LA is very deliberately grandiose and liminal. And there's a wonderful, phantasmagorical element to that. Like, it's a dream. And even at the end of Terminator 2, that really horrible ending where she talks about it as being a dream, that for her, never ends. And it doesn't really seem to end things.
Mm.
When someone tells you that what you're dealing with isn't real, you still respond to the language in a way that fills you with the presence of something else within what you're being shown. Even if you pull the curtain aside and you realize the mechanical elements of it, there's still something that's being generated during the interaction between you and these devices. And that's kind of the point of Walpole's novella. And then moving forward, the point of something like Lovecraft, where he has Under the Pyramids, or The Tomb, or At the Mountains of Madness with the Alien City. Though in his case, and in the case of a lot of Gothic stories, at its most basic, it doesn't belong to the past, despite using past language. It doesn't belong to the present either. You're kind of dislocated. You're set adrift. Someone like Lovecraft would want to have that feeling, which makes you more susceptible to other things that you're trying to suggest. This must be from another world, something like Cthulhu. If you don't have your bearings straight, you're not really sure of where you are. Then if someone like Lovecraft comes up to you and says, well, this is the city of the elder things, or this is Cthulhu, and he comes from the stars, it almost primes you to kind of roll with it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that you have to take it at face value, but it's a way to allow you to suspend your disbelief.
It's easier to suspend your disbelief about an ancient alien civilization on Earth that is rediscovered than it is to be present for an alien invasion in the current, like if the Elder Things showed up in the present time of when At the Mountains of Madness was depicted, that would be a much different feeling story than just finding their ruins.
Their ruins, their remains. Yeah, exactly. And the invasion of the past occurs through hauntology. It occurs through suggestion and language and what's left behind. Even if that what's left behind happened yesterday and someone said, okay, guys, set to alien, we got to make it look spooky, we have to make it look alien and old, we're going to leave behind, make a mess, all right, some cobwebs here, spray the perfume, grab the pieces of cardboard, kind of waft it around. There's a feeling of the derelict, something as old, abandoned, as opposed to, well, you can just walk up to the aliens and have a conversation with them a la Star Trek, where there is no past. If you do have a conversation with a figure in a Gothic story, it tends to be parasocial, where you're either seeing a recording, like in a hologram, you see a ghost, which conveys a message to you that you're not sure is real, or you're not sure if the ghost actually did it to you, or if you had a nightmare about it. There's always like an element of uncertainty. Whereas I feel like certain stories would do away with the ambiguity of the past. The mists of time would be done away with. It would be swept up and clean. And that sense of that space as being left behind to be rediscovered in the present, all of that muddies the waters intentionally.
So I want to, just for the sake of clarity of the topic of hauntology, how would you separate the hauntological from pastiche?
Gerald Hogel had a concept called the ghost of the counterfeit, where there is this sense of replication of the palimpsestuous past, where we're kind of responding to images of the past that were built upon other images of the past, relative to the past as something that exists within the public imagination over time. And pastiche is the attempt to, instead of parodying something, pastiche is creating a likeness of it in a way that's very sort of overt. So a good example of pastiche would be Stranger Things, where they're trying very pointedly to direct you towards previous texts. Like pastiche involves like specific texts more generally, or a combination of them, and Stranger Things is a good example of that. But all of those texts occurred within a very set historical period. So the 1970s and 1980s. Stranger Things is 1980s pastiche. The pastiche And the recreation and the collection of all of these different things together is trying to convey the 1980s as nostalgic in a way that feels like a recreation of that. Whereas the ontological is presenting something that is neither the 1980s nor the present, where you're experiencing this thing. And it's
more the essence and the replica.
It's the essence dislocated from history itself, and where you would have like images and things that feel like they came from a particular period, but like you said, they are the essence of it more generally, as opposed to the replica of Spielberg or Jim Henson or John Carpenter. And that's kind of the difference between Pastiche and Hauntology. Hauntology is about the essence of it. And the essence is also, it goes beyond what you would associate historically with something. And there's this sense of the unknown relative to there being so much more, where you feel familiar with it, but that anchoring element, history, like, oh, I know Jim Henson, I know Steven Spielberg, I know George Lucas. Those elements aren't there. And all you have is the feeling, which isn't attached to something that you can sort of associate with your own childhood, your own upbringing, your own sense of being. All you have is the sense of the past in a way that has nothing to do with your childhood except for having a sense of imitation. And it can be kind of disorienting because it suggests that that type of thing can be replicated, but also just not attached to any of those things. And that's ontology for you, because when you feel that, a part of you wants to say, this isn't, but it feels like it is, so it almost has an uncanny kind of effect, where you want to say, this never existed, this isn't how this was. But the Gothic has, since Walpole's day, used that type of feeling to convey a sense of the past, for whatever agenda it might be used for entertainment, delight, pointing out how these things can be collected and used in a hauntological way. And ontology, in that sense, can also be used in music. Ontology in vaporwave, for instance, where you have this kind of elevator music, and music that you might hear in a commercialized setting or a business type setting. It's being used in a very postmodern kind of way. I don't like to use the word postmodern because people tend to get fixated on what post is versus what modern is. A simpler way to say it is a deconstructive way, which is what Derrida is all about. So it's pretty appropriate that hauntology, vaporwave, postmodern, it all kind of rotates around some of these ideas. He didn't invent them, he just kind of drew people's attention to them. But they've been used in the Gothic, and they don't have to be Gothic, because again, vaporwave focuses on that type of business, casual music. It's sort of torn apart and put back together in a slow, dreamy kind of way that's meant to convey the essence of the past that feels loosely connected to a particular time period. And that's another important thing that I don't know if I clarified well enough, is that the past that Walpole is trying to convey is a general sort of element, like the medieval period. The Gothic period isn't just any point in the past. It's a specific point in time, but it's a broad, murky window of time. The Dark Ages, essentially. Whereas something like vaporwave or synthwave or darkwave is referring more to something like the 1970s and 80s, where the essence that you're conveying occurs relative to a broad window of time. And how broad or how narrow you want that to be is kind of up to the artist. But plenty of artists nowadays will focus on nostalgia in a hauntological way according to a very narrow period of time. Whereas the Gothic, more generally, would have been a bit broader, because the Gothic period was broad. And it's not the Gothic period that we think of, the Renaissance period, a Gothic architecture, which itself was created based on an idea of Germanic tribes and cultures. These types of buildings, which are a replication of a concept, not an actual thing. So again, the essence of something. Or the idea. And Pastiche is much more palimpsestual. It's just sort of rote replication where you can kind of go off a checklist, but it doesn't tend to have that essence so much. Even if you can pinpoint the time, okay, we're getting in our time machine, boys and girls, and we're going to the 1980s. And here are all these things. And it feels very neat. And the effect is to just kind of put you within a very specific period. Whereas Essence is much more murky. And it's much more disorienting. Yeah. And in the Gothic, it kind of makes sense that they would want to focus on that. So I guess that kind of begs the question, is Stranger Things Gothic? Is Pastiche Gothic? I mean, that's a really broad kind of question. So to narrow it down a little bit, if you were trying to be Gothic, would you want to aim for Pastiche, the way that Stranger Things does, or would you want to be hauntological? Because if Stranger Things was really trying to be ontological, they wouldn't have the palimpsests presented in front of you. They wouldn't be playing footage of John Carpenter's The Thing. They would make their own kind of movie and put it on television in the background. And
it's 80s-ish.
80s-ish, exactly. And there has to be a sense of reinvention. Yeah. And Pastiche, that type of Pastiche, does away with a lot of the type of reinvention that made the Gothic what it was. And I'm not saying that it was always as successful as Walpole's notion of, but that's the heart of it. Pastiche can be a little bit lazy sometimes because you're only sticking to one text or a series of texts that you're trying to faithfully recreate. But instead of recreating the text, you would want to create the essence of something which goes beyond just the textual elements, I guess. And
you're kind of creating a alternate version of that time period rather than, granted, a lot of effort can go into Pastiche depending on how accurate they want it to be, whereas you're world building a bit with the hauntological. You're taking a general time frame, but you're making your own version of it.
That's not a bad way to look at it. And there's a sense of alternate reality with the hauntological, but there's less historical elements, the historical material components that they strip mine in Stranger Things is gone. And instead you just have things that look like they could have come from a period or even come off the set of The Dark Crystal or The Thing or Christine, something like that. I'm not saying that I don't enjoy Stranger Things for some of those reasons, but by the time you get to the third season, that's all that they got. Yeah. They don't have anything else. Now, the first season is great because there's so much more of we're telling a story that is just kind of peppered with these pastiche elements. But the more that you progress into season 2 and season 3, where they're really going out of their way to kind of point at actual history instead of reinventing it.
Like, you remember this?
Exactly. Yeah. Remember Ronald Reagan? Things like that aren't important. They're not what makes ontology in a Gothic sense. And Walpole, in particular, would have suits of armor. He would have effigies. He would have a castle and trapdoors and sort of this Escher approach to architecture and why is there a trapdoor here? And you pull the lever on the statue's arm and it opens up a secret passage. I remember watching the Monster Squad and they're trapped by a werewolf, vampire girls, and Dracula coming at them from 3 different directions. And the main character, Sean, says to his buddy, have you ever read The Hardy Boys? And he looks at the statue and he pulls on the arm and then the floor underneath them opens up and they fall down this passageway. And you think, okay, that self-awareness relative to like the setting that they're in this old mansion that's full of all of these textual elements that have come alive and is walking around. That's Gothic reinvention. Now, in the case of Dracula and Wolfman and that type of stuff, pastiche, because they're the universal monsters that have come to life again. And then they're like, oh, the Hardy Boys and the statue and the trapdoors. But that also alludes to an older period in history where kings were expected to escape when they were under siege, and they would have cavernous basements to their castles. Like, that's not a total fabrication. But notice how it comes together in a way that's very nebulous. You can have pastiche elements, and you can have hauntological elements, but they're really separate kind of things. Yeah. And the ontological can work within replicated elements. Yeah. Because you don't just have things that are Gothic-y. You do have certain historical palimpsests that would be inserted into a story. Lovecraft is horrendously guilty of that. But also something like Stranger Things, where they have all of this pastiche stuff, but then they have the Demogorgon, which, to my knowledge, is a D&D monster that never actually existed. The Simulacra, which is something that is being copied and copied over and over, but it never existed. And that's kind of what ontology is. So you have the pastiche elements, which are being replicated. They did exist, but they're also based off things that are just constantly being fabricated and stuff like that. But they're rooted in history, let's say. Mm-hmm. And then you have ontology, where people are taking the essence of the Great Pyramids in these different stories. Or Antarctica is a good example. Alien, At the Mountains of Madness, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym from Edgar Allan Poe, and older stories than that, where you're going out into the unknown and, hey, there's monsters and things like that.
Or even like artifacts of unknown age and origin that have been cursed or something.
Yeah, that's M.R. James' approach to things. He was an antiquarian, and he would write more about artifacts that were cursed as opposed to more of a generalized kind of setting or tomb. That a similar kind of thing can be applied at different levels. Like you can have a castle or a space, or you can just have a haunted object. There are so many stories like that. Mm-hmm. But that sense of just a continuous replication of where you're constantly engaging with the past, and when you do that, you make your own version of it. And how many directors approach the past that way, where they see a film, and then they have a dream, and then they think it's just them, but they're being informed by a past form of media that is hauntological, or it's pastiche, a bit of this, a bit of that. But then they go on and make their own story, which operates in a very, hopefully, a very similar kind of way. Yeah. And hopefully a little bit more ontological, because that's when things really get... It feels like it has spirit if you do that. Whereas if you do pastiche, it feels like a skeleton. It feels like you're just doing the bare minimum. And it's kind of saying that history is limited. Like concrete, finite history that we can point to and say that this happens, that's limited. But your imagination, knows no limits. It's not that everything that's being communicated through Gothic imagination is true, but there's so much that you can inundate and suggest that has been forgotten. And that it's an important tool for tapping into our intuitive side. So much of history, as it actually occurred, in the Lacanian sense of the real, everything that ever existed, the grand total of existence, is something that we have to communicate imperfectly through language. But the Gothic allows us to kind of get away from just the fixed nature of language and to communicate with these hauntological feelings. And then you can add some other things into the mix. You can make it abject, you can make it uncanny, you can throw in the exotic, the alien, werewolves.
Well, another thing that's really convenient about the Dark Ages, for example, is another thing we think of for that time period is superstition. Superstition being very powerful.
When you are in a particular state of mind,
right,
it can really guide the audience.
But it's easier to kind of pretend like what if those superstitions were true and run with that in a story.
Exactly.
Then trying to work with modern times where, there are superstitious people, but it's just a lot harder to insert the supernatural and still have it
the verisimilitude of things, the notion of it's easier to tell a Gothic story where you entertain these things as being real. Going back to the Monster Squad. Science is real. Monsters are not. Well, if you adopt that modern mindset and you just exclude all of these things, then you're kind of guilty of abjecting the past. And when you do that, there's a sense of denial relative to so many things. You don't know what you're excluding at that point. And the purpose of ontology is to allow you to enter a state of mind where you can intuit the unspeakable portions of the past through Gothic romance and reinvention in a hauntological way with a little pastiche. That sense of it's constantly happening over and over. Just because you're aware of all of these things doesn't do away with its most important thing, which is it allows you to open your mind
Mm-hmm.
instead of closing it. I have certainly heard the argument that that is done at the expense of reason and science and all of that, but it isn't. It's more of engaging with a particular way of thinking about things.
Mm-hmm.
It's tricky because it does wind up with certain caricatures of scientists that people aren't especially fond of. If you're a real scientist, you don't want to be thought of as a mad scientist. These are artifacts that are left behind in that trail, if you will, from Walpole to Anne Radcliffe to Mary Shelley to M.R. James to Lovecraft to Stephen King to Thomas Ligotti to Jeff Vandermeer to whoever the next big person is. Like, there is a trail of things, but the historical trail is a history of reinvention versus history in the sense of external things that are ostensibly outside of the text, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Like, there is a trail of authors responding to authors, and they're all responding to the sense of when people open their minds are being opened by a past text, and then they create a text, and it causes you to open your mind, but in a way that's sort of unique to that text, which was created at a certain point in time. So the hauntological components are influenced by the time at which that story was created.
Mm-hmm.
Like Lovecraft, when he wrote his stories, they have hauntological elements and a lot of pastiche, and it's thrown together in a very sort of Walpolean kind of way. But he's informed by being someone who was alive in Providence in the early 20th century. Whereas Walpole was a member of Parliament in Britain in the mid-1700s. So just because ontology deals with the essence of something, it doesn't mean that they're just totally excluded from, but they walk that tightrope between here and there. And they deliberately try and push themselves far away enough from actual history that if any type of history they're going to be associated with, most prominently, it would be a history of texts.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of the ghost of the counterfeit, because that feels kind of nebulous.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it sort of distances you from that sense of limited reality, and you're lost within a series of books, a series of cinema, a series of video games, a sense of existing in media itself, being lost in the pages of something, as opposed to, well, this is concrete. This existed on planet Earth at one point. So did books, but there's a distancing between the book and the fact that it belonged on Earth. And it plays off that notion of ontology as putting you in a space where you can't safely say where you are. And it plays off that idea of ontology and Gothic reinvention as the essence being partly defined by the practice itself as kind of self-reifying. Because so much of the Gothic is just the stuff of stories. And Walpole himself had Strawberry Hill House. It was a neo-Gothic sort of villa, which was populated with all of these artifacts, which went on to become the castle of Otranto. There's a real-world equivalent to that, where he's deliberately trying to excise this real physical house from history, and it's sort of the palimpsest for the book. William Beckford, when he wrote Vathek, did that as well. But the attempt to make it not quite so immediate, you know, it's not like there's a big sign, again, Stranger Things, where, remember that? And it takes you immediately to this tangible moment. What if you could do away with that? If you could sever it, not completely, but to the point that you lose your way and you become lost in that middle kind of territory.
80s-ish.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that kind of covers all of the bases. Palimpsests, the pastiche, simulacra, what's the difference between a replica and the essence of something.
Yeah.
And you can't really get away from that. Its connection with history, textually versus canonically, let's say. The Gothic is very uncanonical when it activates its ontological sort of elements. Like, you're trying to distance yourself from that pastness, which is informed by different centuries, what type of person was writing this story. it's also important to acknowledge the fact that they don't exist in a vacuum, and that sense of playful reinvention, where that 80s-ish quality, if we're dealing with that type of thing, where you're swimming around in all of this stuff, it's very deconstructed. That's going to happen through any attempts to keep things discrete. It sort of goes against the idea of reinvention as being sort of sticky. Because nothing is like totally ontological just by itself. Nothing is totally like this or that. Some people like to say the monk is a totally horrifying story. But oftentimes these things work together, or they work in tandem with one another. And in the case of ontology, it creates something for everything else to kind of occupy and swim around. Not quite the same thing as atmosphere, because there's a very particular sort of thing that's going on relative to language, as opposed to atmosphere is more the suggestion of something very particular through language, as opposed to how language operates itself.
Right.
So yeah, that's the hauntological. Lastly, this podcast is available exclusively on YouTube for the time being. If you want to support us, the work that we do on this podcast, you can go to my Patreon, which will be linked in the description below. And until then, thanks for watching, and take care.
Bye.